So welcome to everybody. If you don't know me, my name is Megan DeBroat. So I'm going to be moderating today. We have young people on from many countries around the world for this class and discussion with Helga LaRouche. I just wanted to name a couple of them, and if I didn't name your country, please feel free to put it in the chat. So we have participants from the United States, Germany, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, France, Spain, Chile, Ecuador, and am I missing? Oh, Iraq. And I'm sure I've missed some. So feel free to put your country in the chat so that we have a sense of where we are across the world. So just to be brief, to give a little introduction, the idea for today's class and discussion arose partly in conjunction with the upcoming Schiller Institute conference, which will take place 2 weekends from now, in which there's going to be a panel which is entitled "The Coincidence of Opposites, the Only Truly Human Thought Process." So that's one reason for today's class, but more broadly, Nicholas of Cusa's discovery of the method of thinking of the coincidences of opposites is the center of everything that the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement are doing internationally. Everything we're doing to try to move the world off of this dark age trajectory and into a new paradigm. It's not a program, it's not a formula, it's a way of thinking, which, as I have learned from many years of having the privilege of working with Helga and Lyndon LaRouche, is the most important thing governing human history. So therefore, young people in particular have a special responsibility to master and bring this possibility of a new mode of existence to the world. So I don't really want to say more by way of introduction, except to say that I'm very happy and excited that we have Helga here with us today. For the past many decades, Helga, alongside her husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has been one of the most important strategic thinkers and actors on the world stage. And not at all unrelated to that, Helga is also one of the world's foremost scholars in Nicholas of Cusa. So I think we can just get underway. The last thing I'll say to all of you here participating is concentrate, take notes. After Helga's initial presentation, we're going to open it up for questions, full dialogue. Everyone who has a question, who has a thought, will have a chance to present it. So don't hesitate and be ready for that discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Helga.
Yes, hello. I'm very happy to talk to so many young people from so many places because, you know, we are in a period of history where decisions are being made which can be either catastrophic, and if you look at the present, geopolitical confrontation as it is shaping up between the so-called West and Russia and China, if we don't overcome this geopolitical clash, this idea that there is such a thing as an interest of one country or a group of countries which have to be absolutely defended, even with military means, against other groups of countries, we will end up in the Third World War. And we are very close to that. But also there are many regional conflicts, domestic conflicts in different countries, which seem to have unsurmountable differences between different political parties, different ethnic groups. And, you know, if you don't overcome these conflicts, you may have civil war, you may have a collapse of society. And, that is why this concept by Nicholas of Cusa, the coincidence of opposites, coincidentia oppositorum, in my view, is an incredibly important approach. And in my view, it is consistent with the method of Leibniz, with the method of Vernadsky, with the method of Einstein, and emphatically the method of Lyndon LaRouche. And as I will only start to talk about, because the life of Nicholas of Cusa is incredibly rich. He was not an academic. He developed all of these concepts while he was fighting politically. He was traveling throughout Germany. He did propose and in part carry out reforms which would have made Martin Luther superfluous, because he wanted to clean out the church at a point, when the church had a severe moral crisis. So he was writing the most profound concepts while being the most active political person. But before I start to go into some of his concepts and ideas, well, I want you to get a sense, because Nicholas of Cusa lived in the 15th century from 1501 to 1564, but he was an incredibly interesting person, and you have to sort of develop a personal relationship. And once you do that, I mean, I find his writings some of the most rewarding exercises. Whenever I feel my thought process is in confusion, in trouble, I normally have a couple of thinkers. I go and sort of, gas up my tanks, so to speak. And he is for sure one which is, putting your thought process in order. Now, first of all, I want to get you a sense of some of the environment from which he came. And please show the first picture. Now, this is an engraving from my hometown, Trier. The reason why I'm showing it is because, Trier is only about 30 minutes by car away from Bernkastel-Kues, where Nikolaus is born. And he is called Cusanus because this is the Latin form of Kues, which is the village on one side of the Mosel, and Bernkastel is on the other side. And he was also called Treverensis, the man from Trier. That's why I show you this picture. Now, as I said, if you travel nowadays 30, next picture, 30 minutes by car, you come to a very beautiful place. This is, in Bernkastel, and, as you can see, this is the Mosel, and the White House there is his birthplace. So this is the birth house as it looks today. It's a museum. And if you ever come to Bernkastel-Kues, you should absolutely visit this, because, they have there many exhibitions and all the books, and it's a very fun place to study. Okay, now next picture. Now the next picture you see is his hospital. This is the one side. You can see it has a little church in there, and it was a home for the elderly, which Cusanus donated. You see the small Gothic church, and the home for the elderly. He donated with some of his money, and it consistently was in existence for 590 years. So when you go there, and obviously when you come to Germany, you absolutely must go there because it's one of the most exciting places. You can see that there are still old people living in this place. This is the Wine Cultural Center, and they sell wines which are grown there, but this place is very, very important. And the reason is that this was the place where we had the 65th birthday of Lynn, and where Norbert Breinin, the first violinist of the Amadeus Quartet, and the famous Italian pianist Carlo Levi-Minci performed Beethoven's Opus 96 Sonata for Violin and Piano in 1987 on the 9th of September. So if you then at some other time look at this beautiful birthday performance for Lynn's birthday, you have a sense where it took place. This is immediately in the vicinity of this hospital and elderly home. And, this was one of the most beautiful moments really in our life, because you had everything together. Nicholas of Cusa, Beethoven, Lin's birthday, Norbert Breinin, Carlo Levi-Minci, and the entire European organization. So then we see here the library of Nicholas of Cusa. This is a very special place. This picture does not do total justice of it, but when you enter this room, I mean, when I went there the first time, sort of, 40 years ago or so, they still had all the handwritings from the 8th, the 9th, the 10th century and others in openly lying there. You could actually touch them, you could see them. And this was the library of Nicholas of Cusa, and you could actually see what he had in his possession, what access he had to sources. He had many notes on the sides of some of these manuscripts. And when you are in this room, even today, where they have everything much more digitalized and under glass and so forth to protect it from the many tourists, you still get, there are some places where if you enter them, you feel the spirit of history, and you think about the great creative thoughts which have been thought in these places. And for me, this library I think it's the oldest private library in Germany of that size. It's one of the absolute sacred places, because it gives you a sense of the person who lived there. Next picture, here is another side. You see the astronomical instruments in the back, where on the left side, where you could see what astronomical instruments Cusa had available for his observations. Okay, as I said, he was born in 1401. His father was called Henne Krifts, which means Krebs, which was the name. He ran a ferry boat from Bernkastel to Kues over the Mosel, and also shipping goods on the Mosel up and down. Now, Nicholas was one of 4 children, and naturally his father took him on these travels on the Mosel. So now, next picture, you should get a sense of what this Mosel looked like. You see the Mosel Valley is very picturesque. It has steep hills, it has gentle hills, beautiful villages and towns, castles and woods. And yeah, this is actually the downtown of Bernkastel. This is another castle. So you must imagine that young Nikolaus was traveling back and forth in this environment. And since the first impressions of childhood are extremely important to form the beauty or not so beauty of the mind, I wanted to give you a sense of what the environment where he comes from, because what made him what made him stick out among all the siblings and other pupils was that he was incredibly intellectually curious and wanted to investigate everything, even when he was a small boy. Now, there are only verbal witnesses, no written records, but it seems that he very soon went to the Brothers of the Common Life at Deventer. This was an order which was created by Gerhard de Groot, the teaching order, which basically was what prepared everybody for studies in universities. And the key thing was that it would encourage the student for a self-reliant studying. Now, he for sure entered the University of Heidelberg in 1416. This was in the middle of the very famous controversy between the Pope and the Synod of Bishops, which convened in Basel. And it was, among other things, over the question, who had superiority? Was it more the parliamentarian approach of the Synod, or was it the Pope? Now, then after 1.5 years, Nicolaus went to the University of Padua, which in Italy, which was one of the most important intellectual centers in Italy. And he actually studied jurisprudence, church law, canon law. And there he made the acquaintance of many, many of the famous representatives of his time in mathematics, astronomy, medical science, humanists. He made, for example, the acquaintance of Giuliano Cesarini, and he kept a lifelong friendship with him. Cesarini was a little bit older, and he introduced him to Plato and Aristotle. Then he became a professor at the university, and later a famous, very important cardinal. He also taught Nicolaus the Greek language. He also became friends with Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who was later Pope Pius II. Also friendship with Paolo del Pozzo Toscanelli, the famous author of the maps which were used by Columbus, which Toscanelli had proposed to a famous letter to Martin de Moritz, that one could reach China and India going west on the ocean, which became the basis for Columbus' discovery of the Americas. In 1423, Nicolaus became the doctor of canon law, and then continued his studies in Cologne, where he became the secretary of the papal legate Giordano Orsini. And from that moment on, Cusa really started to take part in the top affairs of the church and the different states. Now, having been in Padua in contact with the humanists, he was absolutely steeped in the idea that you have to go back to the sources. You cannot believe what the professors tell you. You have to go to the handwritings of the original thinkers. And so he participated in a total excitement of finding old documents in the monasteries and libraries of churches. So he found 16 forgotten comedies by the Roman poet Plautus, and that added one more aspect to his fame. And his research also led him to get acquainted with many, many writings from Roman, Greek, and Neoplatonic thinkers. One of them was Dionysius Areopagita, who was a Neoplatonic writer, but it was written in a Christian framework. So in one of these documents, an Athenian member of the council of the city is mentioned, who supposedly, according to this document, would have converted to Christianity. But there were ideas coming out of his mouth, which were ideas actually formulated by Plotin, another Neoplatonic thinker in the 3rd century AD, and his pupil Proclus, also a Neoplatonian. But these people actually wrote in the 5th century AD by an author whose name is a pseudonym, who used that to make his argument more authoritative. Now, Nicolaus really was very fond of these writings, but he started to doubt their authenticity because he noticed that these thoughts, which were written only in the 5th century, were not mentioned by authors in the 1st and the 2nd century. Now, he discovered, therefore, that these documents were fake news, which obviously was much more difficult than nowadays. You have search engines and do comparisons and so forth. But at that time, you had to go through these incredible, difficult handwritings, and it just is a very important way how Cusanus approached anything. He didn't just take it; he explored it, and he also found the proof that the famous Constantinian donation was a fraud. This he wrote in the Concordantia Catholica, his first major works in 1433. And it has, the Constantinian donation is the narrative that Emperor Constantine, who governed from 306 to 336 in Augusta Treverorum, this city I showed you in the beginning, Trier, because when the Roman Empire was divided in 4 parts, the seat of the emperor north of the Alps was actually in my hometown in this Augusta Treverorum, which is the Latin name for it. And it has the very famous basilica, which was the seat of Emperor Constantine. This is a very important building from the 4th century. The core of it is even built earlier. And today it's a Protestant church, but this was the seat of Emperor Constantine, who has some fame because he introduced Christianity into the Roman Empire. Now, the story of who gave this Constantinian donation or not was important because it had to do with the power games. Because if the if the emperor gave it to the Vatican, then this was relevant for power games in these times. So Nicolaus also identified that this was a fraud. It was in reality an invention of the 8th century, and Nicolaus documents that the Constantinian donation is not mentioned in the centuries after Constantine, but that the so-called Pipinian donation was not the reintroduction of an older legal status, but a favor by King Pippin III to Pope Stephan II in 757. Now, the reason why I'm telling you that is because I want to give you a sense of Cusanus's mind, that he would not go for dogma, but for historical truth finding. Now, in 1432, he went to Basel, where the Bishop Synod was still taking place, and he became the secretary of Cesarini, and there he started to write the famous Concordantia Catholica, a document which was written for the Council of Basel. Now, this document is extremely important, and in some other occasion, I made a long history of the emergence of the sovereign nation state. Now, this was not self-evident, and most people, when they talk about nations, they have no idea where it comes from. But in European history, the emergence from the emperor, from the Vatican church state, which was all European, the emergence of individual nations, like France being the first sovereign nation, England the second one, and then eventually many more, was a very, very difficult process. And this book, Concordantia Catholica, represents an absolute breakthrough. In book 1 and 2, he discusses a reform of the church. In the third book, the reform of the Holy Roman Empire. And for the first time, he is demanding constitutional demands for the ruler, a major step forward to the modern constitutional law and separation of powers. It's a completely new idea of the natural freedom and equality of all human beings as the basis for their participation in government. Nikolaus writes in the Concordancia Catholica, quote, therefore, since all are by nature free, every governance, whether it consists in a written law or in a living law in the person of a prince, can only come from the agreement and the consent of the subjects. For if men are by nature equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler, who is their equal in power, can only be constituted by the election and the consent of the others. And the law is also established by consent. Now, this was a completely new idea, totally revolutionary, that the rulers and the governed are equal and equally free. Because remember, until that point, really until the 15th century, all forms of government, at least in the European world, were oligarchies, where you had a small oligarchical elite who had an interest to keep the masses backward, to treat them like slaves or helots, to cull the herd if there were too many. And the idea that you needed the consent of the governed was such a revolutionary concept that it really is an absolute breakthrough. And I think from the standpoint of state law, Cusanus is completely underrated, because people, if they would discuss the origin of the nation state, you would see how important this is, because the system which Cusanus developed is the first time a representative system where you have a reciprocal legal relationship between the government and the governed. So this is based. He also said what is true for the German is also true for the Ethiopian. So right in the Concordancia, he basically treats it as a universal principle, true for Africa as well as Europe. Now in book 3, he continues, natural law precede all human considerations and provide the principle for them all. First, nature intends every kind of animal to preserve its physical existence and its life, to avoid what could be harmful, and to secure what is necessary to it. For the first requirement of essence is that it exists. If one were to write a new constitution for a world of sovereign nation states, that should be one of the axioms, because the right of existence is a very important primary philosophical ontological concept. He continues, but from the beginning, men have been endowed with reason, which distinguishes them from animals. They know, because of the existence of their reason, that association and sharing are most useful indeed, necessary for their self-preservation and to achieve the purpose of human existence. Therefore, human beings have built cities and adopted laws to preserve unity and harmony, and they established guardians of all of these laws with the power necessary to provide for the public good. Now, as I said, this was a complete break with the oligarchical form of society, and basically the idea that all legitimate power arises from elective concordance and free submission, and that there is in the people a divine seed by virtue of their common equal birth and the equal natural rights of men, of all men, so that the authority which comes from God, as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of the subjects. One who is established in authority as representative of the will of all may be called a public or common person, the father of all, ruling without haughtiness or pride in a lawful and legitimate established government. Now here you have the seed, the birth hour, so to speak, of the representative system. of the Republic of the United States, among other things, because the United States Constitution was not or is not a democracy, it's a republic. And the representative system, in one sense, is the only way how the individual can participate in government. Because you can't have a basis democracy, because if you have a vote of everybody for every single issue, how many lampposts you have in the middle of the village, what should be the taxation, if everything is recorded that way, you would never get anywhere. And therefore the representative system is the only, when it functions and it requires state citizens, it's the only workable form of government. So Nikolaus continues, while recognizing himself as a creature, as it were, of all of his subjects as a collectivity, let him act as their father, as individuals. That is the divinely ordained marital state of spiritual union based on lasting harmony, by which a commonwealth is best guided in the fullness of peace towards the good of eternal bliss. So a constitution in coherence with the common good, the ruler is asked to act like a father of all, which obviously evokes the feeling of love. And this idea of love is very, very common in all of Nikolaus's writings. So, so he continues, for this purpose, the public welfare, the ruler should have the best qualified of his subjects chosen from all parts of his realm to participate in a daily council with him. These councillors ought to represent all the inhabitants of the realm. These councillors ought constantly to defend the good of the public which they represent, giving advice and serving as the appropriate means through which the king can govern and influence his subjects, and the subjects on proper occasion can influence him in return. The great strength of the kingdom comes from this daily council. The councillors should be appointed to this task by agreement in a general meeting of the kingdom, and they should be publicly bound legally by oath to speak out openly for the public good. Now, that these principles of the Concordancia Catholica, I think they would still give a very valid advice how to organize the political life today, because the reciprocal legal relationship is the way how you could preserve the common good and also make the state function. After Nikolaus wrote this, it took another 343 years until these ideas of a representative system became the American Constitution as the only way to defend the inalienable rights of the individual. They were expressed both in the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. Now, his work, Concordancia Catholica, was written for the Council of the Bishops. And if they would have followed his advice, they could have solved all the problems. But in reality, they were very disunited in many areas and on many subjects. And Nikolaus realized very soon that it would not function to stick with the synod. So he shifted his position from the synod to the position of the papacy. Now, at that time, the other big issue, other than the conflict between the bishops and the Pope, was the break between the conflict between the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox Church. They had separated, and there were negotiations, which, how they could get together. And the Orthodox recognized the council, but not, they did not recognize the council, but the Pope. Now, Cusanus, who had become sort of a little bit famous because of his writing and also his incredible knowledge, he was asked by the Pope to pick up a delegation from Constantinople to participate in the councils of Ferrara and Florence. So he went to Byzantium, to Constantinople, and he took a delegation of the Orthodox Emperor Joseph Palaiologos and a delegation of 700 scholars and leading clerics and handwritings which documented that the filioque emanated equally from the Father and the Son in the early synods in part of the Creed. Now, that may be a dubious issue for nowadays people, but the issue of filioque is very important. It was very important in the church because it was the question if in the Trinity, God, Father, and Logos, if the Logos emanates only from the Father, but also from the Son. Fili means son, and que is the Latin for also, filioque. Now, Nicolaus earlier had found that there must be documents proving that the early councils had the filioque also for what became the Orthodox, and he could find the documents, and that was practically the issue over which the split had occurred, and it played an extremely important role in the unification of the councils of Ferrara and Florence. Now, among the people who traveled from Constantinople to Ferrara was Georgios Gemistos Plethon, who was an advisor of the Byzantine emperor. He knew the entire Plato. Plato had mostly disappeared in Europe after the collapse of ancient Greece. He was an extremely sharp critic of Aristotle, which he also presented in Florence. And he said that Aristotle had absolutely no understanding of Plato because he would have rejected the creation by God as divine providence and the immortality of the soul. And these ideas would be completely incompatible with Christianity. Also in this delegation was the Archbishop of Nicaea, Bessarion, who also was an absolute critic of Aristotle. And he made also a massive intervention for Plato in Italy, and they all met Cosimo di Medici, famous Mäzen, who created the Platonic Academy, because this delegation, for the first time since about 1400 years, brought the entire collection of Plato's work with them. And once that became known in Florence and other Italian cities, there was a complete explosion of excitement of Plato, which found a very fertile ferment of the kinds of people I had mentioned before. So naturally, Nicolaus, and if you traveled by ship in the 15th century from Constantinople to Italy, it would take you several weeks. So in all of these weeks, Nicolaus had plenty of time to have absolute passionate discussions with the Greek Orthodox top intellectuals of their time, Platonists, and so suddenly he had a creative breakthrough. On the ship from Constantinople, where they left in 1437 and arrived 38. So he said, I suddenly had a divine inspiration and I could see all questions in a completely different light. And this approach is the coincidentia oppositorum. And Cusa wrote, very self-conscious, I'm thinking now something which no human being ever has thought before. in a letter from the 14th September 1453, he said that the non-acceptance of contradictory assertions was the common axiom of all philosophies up to now. Not just Aristotle. Aristotle was just the most explicit. So he then writes his second major writing, the De Docta Ignorantia, which he only wrote in 1440, but the ideas he developed on this ship travel. In the beginning of this book, he says, well, people all know hunger, which gives you a very unpleasant feeling in the stomach. And normally it calls for food intake to get strength. Now, amazement, curiosity, is having a similar effect on the mind because it's the cause of philosophizing. The rare, the exceptional, is enormous and impresses us. And in trying to comprehend it, we are striving for truth, and it perfects the mind. The characteristics of all things through a divine gift is to have a natural desire to exist in the best possible way according to their potentiality. Now that is a thought which you may recognize as having reappeared later in Leibniz, who also says that it is the pre-established harmony of the creation that every being and every existence strives to develop in the best possible form in the universe. So Nikolaus continues and says, when the mind investigates something, he does so by comparing that which is absolutely certain with the new unknown phenomena. And that method of investigation Cusa calls the learned ignorance or the knowing ignorance. He says that one starts with the nature of a magnitude of a measurement. The maximum is also the one, since it contains everything. But since it is only one and there is nothing else, it is also the minimum, since there is nothing outside of it. Now that is a thought you have to let sink in. In the first book of De Docta Ignorantia, he investigates the maximum. In the view of all people, that maximum is without any doubt God, because God is the absolute infinity. In the second book, he discusses how the maximum is also the maximum entwined existence. That's another word for the universe. The word as the unfolded infinity in space. And in the third book, the absolute maximum in plurality, which is both the maximum as well as the entwined, which is Jesus Christ, the divine human being, in whom both unite. The maximum, the entwined maximum, is united in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, for those of you who are not religious, don't get scared, because when I started to look at Nikolaus many years ago, I had some trouble, and in the beginning I cherry-picked those thoughts which I thought were exciting and fascinating, and I left out some other thoughts which I thought were not so necessary and so forth. I left out, for example, the entire third book of the Docta Ignorantia, because I said, this is too religious, Later, I recognized that that was really stupid, because, you can approach these writings, and the more you get into it, the more you realize you don't have to take these questions as the fundamentalists. It's not something to, quote from and then take a nominalist interpretation. But if you sort of look between the notes, if you understand that these are concepts full of metaphors, then you can actually grasp a philosophical meaning which is really revolutionary, because Nicholas of Cusa represented a method of thinking which was a complete break with the Middle Ages, the constitution of the thinking of modern times. And, you know, he was the father of modern science, the father of the modern nation state. And once you penetrate behind things which look sort of, in quote, religious in the beginning, you can take it as that. That's not forbidden, but you should struggle to understand it in a higher way. So, so basically, you can access the meaning behind the words if you do that. If you understand these examples in a figurative way as metaphors for what you have to leave, for which you have to leave the realm of the senses to get to a simple understanding, it is obvious that there cannot be a relation between the infinite and the finite. Therefore, the finite mind cannot reach the infinite truth. Now, in Dr. Ignorantia 1, chapter 3, he writes, hence the intellect, which is not truth, never comprehends truth so precisely that truth cannot be comprehended infinitely more precisely. For the intellect is to truth as an inscribed polygon is to an inscribing circle. The more angles the inscribed polygon has, the more similar it is to the circle. However, even the number of its angles is increased ad infinitum, the polygon never becomes equal to the circle unless it is resolved into an identity with the circle. Now, this is the famous quadrature of the circle. You know, can you make a circle out of a polygon? And Nicolaus, you know, discusses this effort by Archimedes, who did not succeed to solve this problem, in an obvious way by making the point that if you add more angles to the polygon ad infinitum, you still do never reach the circle, and therefore you have to make sort of a mental jump and think the circle, which is of a higher quality. He writes, the more deeply, no, this is not a quote. Nicolaus then refers to Pythagoras, the Platonists, Augustinus, Boethius, who all used numbers and mathematics to investigate the soul, immortality, and truth. He quotes the famous philosopher Anselm, who compared the greatest truth with an infinite straightness. I mean, this is a pedagogical way. I mean, you can discuss questions of an ontological nature by using geometry, using numbers. And this is the method which Nicolaus says is completely legitimate, because all of these previous thinkers try to approach truth in this way. He said one can compare the Trinity with a triangle with 3 equal sides and 3 right angles. Can you imagine that? Now, such a triangle must consist, obviously, of infinite sides. It can be called an infinite triangle, and we can agree with that. Others compared God with an infinite line or an infinite sphere, and they all thought about the maximum in the right way. In Dr. Ignorantia 1:13, he writes, I maintain, therefore, that if there were an infinite line, it would be a straight line, a triangle, a circle, a sphere. And likewise, if there were an infinite sphere, it would be a circle, a triangle, and a line. And the same thing must be said about an infinite triangle and an infinite circle. First of all, it is evident that an infinite line could be a straight line. The diameter of a circle is a straight line, and the circumference is a curved line with which is greater than the diameter. So if the curved line becomes less curved, in proportion to the increased circumference of the circle, then the circumference of the maximum circle, which cannot be greater, is minimally curved and therefore maximally straight. Therefore, the minimum coincides with the maximum to such an extent that we can visually recognize that it is the necessary form for the maximum line to be maximally straight and minimally curved. Not even a scruple of doubt about this can remain when we see in the figure, now show the picture, picture 19. Not even a scruple of doubt about this can remain when we see that in this figure here at the side, the arc CD of the larger circle is less curved than the arc EF of the smaller circle, and the arc EF is less curved than the arc GH of the still smaller circle. Hence, the straight line AB will be the arc of the maximum circle, which cannot get greater. And thus we see that a maximum infinite line is necessary the straightest, and no curvature is opposed. Go back to the quote, please. Indeed, the maximum line curvature is straightness, and this is the first thing which was to be proved. Secondly, I said that an infinite line is a maximum triangle, a maximum circle, and a maximum sphere, in order to demonstrate that we must, in the case of finite lines, see what is present in the potency of a finite line. And that which we are examining will become clearer to us on the basis of the fact that an infinite line is actually whatever it presents in the potency of a finite line. To begin with, we know that a line finite in length can be longer and straighter, and I have just proved that the maximum line is the longest and straightest. Next, if while point A remains fixed, go back to the figure 19. If AB is rotated until B comes, this is the second figure, until B comes to C, a triangle is formed. And if the rotation continued until B returns where it began, a circle is formed. Furthermore, if while A remains fixed, B is rotated until it comes to the place opposite where it began, vis-a-vis to D, then from the lines AB and AD, one continuous line is produced and a semicircle is described. And if while the diameter BD remains fixed, the semicircle is rotated, a sphere is formed. And the sphere is the termination of the potency of the line. Go back to the quote. The sphere exists in complete actuality since it is not in potency with respect to any further derivable figure. Therefore, if these figures are present in the potency of a finite line, and if an infinite line is actually all the things with respect to which a finite line is in potency, then it follows that an infinite line is a triangle, a circle, and a sphere. Quod erat demonstrandum. And because presumably you would like to see more clearly how it is that the infinite is actually those things which are present in the potency of the finite, I will now make you very certain of the proof thereof. So here Nicolaus discusses for the first time that the maximum, the infinite line, the infinite triangle, the infinite sphere is the greatest, that it also falls into one with the smallest, the minimum, the coincidence of opposites. in Dr. Ignorantia 1:14, Nicholas says that a thought process that does not transcend the level of the senses does not understand that a line can also be triangular, because if you only look at the sense certainty, your mind protests and says, no, this is a line and not a triangle or not a sphere. But for the comprehending thought process, as Nicholas calls it, it is easy. Since the two sides of a triangular cannot be shorter than the third, it follows that a triangular where one side is infinite, the other two sides must be infinite too. And since there can't be several infinites, they all fall into one. This is the introduction of the infinite into geometric calculations. And one can actually say that Nikolaus prepares for what will become the calculus with Leibniz, the measurement of curvatures and surface areas. It also contains the idea of the eternity of the universe. So in a sermon, many of Nikolaus's excellent breakthroughs, by the way, also occurred in sermons. So in the sermon of January 6, 1456, he writes, furthermore, we can say that because God is eternity, then insofar as time derives from him, and thus the temporal world is and always was from eternity, i.e. from God. The world was always at every time. Now this was obviously not in line with the Old Testament, which said that the world was created in 6 days by God. Now you have to think that in the 15th century, you could not just say these things because, there was, clear papal authority of the interpretation of these things. And in March 1329, there had been a papal pronouncement with the name In Agro Dominico, put out by Pope John the 22nd, which was condemning the 28th thesis of Master Eckhart. Master Eckhart was one can say, a mixture of a Platonist and mystic, but that notion has to be discussed because it's also used nowadays in a different way. But these 28 theses, to 17 of those were declared heretic, and 11 as being suspect of heresy. So Nikolaus liked Master Eckhart, and he had his handwritings from 1440 onward. This was the year he completed the Doctor Ignorantia, and he wrote several comments. One of them, Cave, be careful. Now, can you go back to the picture 7a? Take the picture on the right. Can you take that alone? But in any case, this is a handwriting of the Doctor Ignorantia, and you can see on the right side that there are many notes of what comments by Nikolaus, and one of those said this Cave, be careful. This is actually very beautiful because first of all, you can see that you didn't have the internet, you didn't have Google searches, but you had to write all of these thoughts in these handwritings. So to go through these documents was a gigantic mental effort. And the beauty of these documents in the library of Nikolaus is that he has many of the original writings from all these thinkers. He has made these notes on the side, and therefore you can actually see and study how he interpreted it and what was his conclusion. So because if you say the world has been there eternally, you put into question the 6-day creation. And as you can see with some other people like Giordano Bruno and others, this did not turn out so well for your health. So in any case, Nicolaus came to the conclusion that the universe is infinite, that it neither has a circumference nor a center. So Nicolaus had these ideas well before Copernicus or Galileo. Now, please give me picture 17. Yeah, so this picture, as you can see, is the view Nicolaus had from the ship going from Constantinople to Italy. Now, obviously, that view you can get anywhere on the ocean when you travel by ship. And everybody who has already made a travel over the ocean will have a very acute memory or feeling that what looks like a straight line, namely the horizon, is actually a circumference. And we know that the Earth is not a flat, a straight line or just two-dimensional, but it is a sphere. But I'm pretty sure that since Nicolaus had this breakthrough about the coincidence of opposites and how straight lines in the infinity are also infinite spheres, that this was the environment. You can imagine he was sitting there with the top intellectuals of his time, Plethon, Bessarion, discussing these ideas of Plato and the unity of the church. So I'm absolutely certain that it was this environment which inspired or helped to inspire him to have these ideas. Now Kepler called Nicolaus the divine Cusa. And obviously Kepler's idea about making the breakthrough about gravitation did require that he left the Copernicus view, the idea that either the Earth or the sun are the center of the universe, but that you have to have a completely different principles. So in that sense, Nicolaus prepared the ground for Kepler, who was extremely appreciative of Nicolaus by calling him divine. Now, equally, Vernadsky, Vladimir Vernadsky, called him Cusansky, the great stepping stone. Cusansky is, Nicolaus of Cusa is known in Russia under the name Cusansky, and much more famous than in the West, which speaks for Russian science. Now, the concept of coincidence of opposites is not a static concept or just to be comprehended in terms of geometry, but it includes a concept of the evolution of the universe as a unity. We had seen that God is the absolute unity and greatness, maxi mitas, and the universe as unitas universi, the universe, as a contracted multitude, unitas contracta, and Jesus Christ as the incarnation of the united multitude, the maximum contractum. In this universe is a hierarchical order of the higher and the lower species, and they all are separated by a species jump. Now, Nicolaus says no individual of any species is perfected as long as it only belongs to its own species. It will be only fully accentuated, fully developed, if it participates in the next higher species. For the human beings, that means he has to participate in God, and that is a quality of human beings which Nicolaus calls capax Dei, participating in God. And he describes this evolution as being ripped aloft. In German, emporgerissen, ripped up almost violently, ripped up in a higher level. And likewise, the relation between the anorganic to the plants and the plants to the animal is basically occurring in this way. The potential of the lower species is only accentuated fully if it participates in a higher principle of existence. Professor Haupst, who is one of the great Cusa scholars who created the Cusanus Stiftung, the Cusanus Gesellschaft, Cusanus Society, which resides in Trier, near the Dome, is a beautiful villa house where Professor Haupst had his office. I visited him many times there. And he was one of the people who helped to trigger this renaissance of Cusanus. I mean, today, if you go into all the different languages, you find tons of scholars who are excited about Nikolaus of Cusa. But, you know, Professor Haupst, who was a scholar in Mainz and, you know, of theology, he was actually one who made an incredible discovery of many of the handwritings. He knew, for example, by his studies, that certain handwritings had to be hidden in the library of some private library in London. So he sent 2 assistants, they found the handwritings. So he made an incredible collection, and he started to have the annual Cusanus Symposia, in which I participated one in the early, in the 70s. And then I developed a true friendship with Professor Haupst. So he called this the, quote, biogenetic law of evolution in Cusa. Now, this is really an incredible idea that in the 15th century, you had a concept of evolution following, you know, from theological considerations, which is exactly what evolution truly was, that it is the principle of the higher principle of creation affecting the lower, in the same way like the mind shapes the biosphere. The noosphere is more powerful than the biosphere is more powerful than the anorganic, but that you would have somebody who would not be a Darwinian surviving of the fittest, but the true concept of evolution. So you find in the works of Cusa another one stepping stone for completely new thinking, which I find extremely incredible. So this maximation principle is not a development from below to above. And in De Mente, the writing in the layman about the mind, Nikolaus develops the idea that the knowledge of God emanates from mens, which is the Latin word for the mind, which is the image of God onto all lower levels. And that puts man into an absolutely unique position. The incredible idea here is that God accesses the world through the human mind, because man is imago viva Dei, and God continues the process of creation through the vis creativa, the creative power of man. Now, this is why Lynn always wrote and said that when the mind develops adequate hypotheses, the universe, quote, obeys the creative reason of man. Now, in De Mente, the same writing, Nikolaus develops the idea of the infinite perfectibility of the mind. In another incredibly fascinating writing called De Berillo, this is an allegory that glasses, spectacles, are made out of a beryl, which is a mineral. It looks like a precious stone. That this berillo is cut both in a concave and a convex way. I should have a picture of a concave and convex, but you can imagine it's either turned inward or turned outward, bent inward or bent outward, and that this being concave and convex at the same time is, according to Cusanus, also corresponding to the coincidence of opposites. according to Nikolaus, there are 4 levels of cognition. The first is the sensus, the senses. Second, the understanding, ratio. Third, reason, which is the intellectus, the intellect. But there is a 4th level, which he calls visio, vision. And he, in this writing, quotes this Hermes Trismegistus, which I already mentioned, which, is this, sort of a not quite authentic, but the ideas are authentic, but the name is not authentic, who said the unbelievable sentence, man is a second God. In the same way as God is the creator of the physical universe, the creation, and is man the creator of the concepts, the ideas. Cusa, at the beginning of De Berillo, speaks to the reader that he often speaks about the coincidence of opposites and is trying very hard to get the meaning across, because it's a difficult concept, and people have mental blocks which need to be overcome. But then he says, I must put out a warning, like Plato and Dionysus did before, that it is forbidden to reveal those secrets to those who are not capable of mental elevation, because they, being stuck to the senses, find nothing more ridiculous than these sublime matters. Because those who are caught in their animalistic attitudes don't comprehend the divine secrets. But those who practice and take the explanations will be happy about the mental treasure that they have found. Then he also quotes another thinker, Greek thinker, Protagoras, who says, man is the measurement of all things. Now that is also quite incredible. And he defines, since the cognitive soul is the goal of all cognizable. He quotes again Hermes Trismegistus, who says, man is a second God. As God is the creator of the physical universe, the true existence and the natural forms, man is the creator of ideas, which has a similarity with the divine creative activity. So man has the imago viva Dei, is the living image of God. It's not God who lives, it's the image which lives. This is very important. Imago viva means living image of God, because the image is not a dead image, it's a living image, because it continues the process of creation. And this is possible because he has the vis creativa, the creative power, because he can participate in God, capax Dei. Now, this is incredible, because if you think that, you can always judge a philosopher by his image of man. Now, if you think what image of man, for example, the English Enlightenment representative has, Locke, Hobbes, man is a beast, you need the strong state to contain the evil, or private evil creates public good, Mandeville, all these terrible images of man, and on the other side you have Schiller, who has this beautiful image of the man as a beautiful soul. You have Humboldt as the most incredible beauty of the character, which can be accomplished through education. I mean, the image of man is really how you judge a philosopher. And Nikolaus is, for me, one of the people who have the most incredible, powerful image of man. And this consoled me with this question of Jesus Christ, because when you look at it philosophically, and those who are religious are welcomed to look at it in a religious way, the idea that the incarnation of God in the person of Jesus Christ makes him participate in all the qualities of the Creator. And this has a limitless perfectibility. I think that this is the strongest manifestation of the creative identity of the human person. And Nikolaus says, you know, when man is creative, he is a second God, he is divine. So in all writings, Nikolaus uses a very clearly Socratic pedagogy, how to lead the reader from something seemingly obvious to the highest cognitive insights, because man, defined in the way I said, is a microcosm who in his thought process corresponds to the macrocosm. Now that is why the human mind producing ideas which can affect the macrocosm. With other words, you know, we would say in modern terms, the idea created by the human mind can produce a scientific discovery, which, if it's applied as a technology in the production process, leads to a higher productivity and higher living standard of the people, higher longevity, and therefore changes the physical universe. I mean, Lynn wrote about this in so many writings, but you find here in Cusa the reason why this is possible, why an immaterial idea in the microcosm has a physical effect in the macrocosm. Now, obviously, this is also then later in a different form discussed by Leibniz, that, you know, every human being is a monad, which contains in principle all the lawfulness of the entire universe, and, you know, is the image of the divine. Now, in another very fun writing called The Globus Game, Nikolaus speaks of a threefold world: the small, which is man; the large, which is the universe; and the greatest, which is God. Man is both a small and a complete world, as well as he participates in the larger universe, since there can be only one universe. So therefore, man is not outside the universe, but he is both a separate, complete world, but at the same time, part of the large universe. And the fulfillment of man is the self-perfectibility and likeness of God. Now, Lynn and I went many times to Bernkastel-Kues, visiting the library, visiting the birth house. And one time we went with a very dear friend, a very high-ranking, actually a very high-ranking scholar from Rome, from the Vatican. And we played the Globus game. Now, the Globus game is another one of these pedagogical devices by Nikolaus, how he takes from a game. The game is, you have a sphere, a ball, which is sort of carved in such a way that it has a convex and a concave element to it. So when you throw it, it does not go in straight lines, but it goes in spirals. And the game is such that you have on the ground, I think 9 circles with a center, and you have to throw the ball in such a way that, first of all, it remains on the surface, but that it gets as close to the center as possible, which takes some skills and a little bit of luck, I would say. So we went there with this high guest discussing Cusanus' ideas, and we were playing the Globus game, which is in the birth house of Cusanus for visitors to play. And the high-ranking friend, he completely missed it. The ball went somewhere in a corner. I was doing badly too. And Lynn threw it, and it went to the center. I personally think it was a lucky accident, But, Lynn was convinced that he had mastered the principle, and he may have. So this is one of the questions which will probably never be answered, but it was a lot of fun. And, it's a lot of fun because from a simple game, you can arrive at the most profound ideas about God, the universe, the creation, and the nature of man. Now, there is another very useful writing, which was one of his later writings, called De Visione Dei, about the vision of God. And this was written as a request from the abbot and the monks from the monastery in Tegernsee, with whom he had a friendship going over many decades. And they asked him repeatedly, help us to understand this concept of the coincidence of opposites, because it's such a difficult concept. Can you not write something which explains it so that we can all understand it? And so Nicolaus wrote this, and it is indeed pedagogically a very beautiful works which you should read. So he says in the beginning, you all know that there are several Renaissance paintings, and he names several of them, from which places they come, where they are being kept. And he says some of these paintings have a perspective that, for example, if you have a person, in this case, it's the picture of Jesus Christ, it's painted in such a way that no matter from where you look at that picture, you always have the feeling it is looking straight at you and only at you. So he asks the monks that they should all put this picture, in the background of the room, and then form a circle, like standing in a half circle around it, one on the left and the next one to him until the right. So you have a half circle of monks. And then he says, isn't it like that you all have the feeling that this picture only looks at you, no matter where you stand, and you can move backward and forward in any position, you will have that feeling. And then from there, he continues to discuss how that is possible and how he arrives at what he then calls the wall of the coincidence of opposites. Now, there he creates another problem, because he says when the earlier coincides with the later and the end coincides with the beginning, and the alpha coincides with the omega, and he uses this picture of the monks going around in this room to demonstrate that principle. Then you are at the wall of coincidence, not yet at the coincidence of opposites. And he says, you need another step. You need to mentally jump over that wall, to see behind that wall, to participate in the coincidence of opposites, which is only in God. Now, this idea of the coincidence of the earlier and the later, the end and the beginning, the alpha and the omega, this is what Lynn is describing in several of his writings as the eternity, the simultaneity of eternity. So I want to leave it at that. I hope I have tasted your appetite so that you will start to read these things, which are difficult to get used to. In the beginning, you say, what language is that? But once you make the mental exercise to start to follow the manductio, as Haupt called it, of Cusanus, you will start to see things in a completely different light. You will definitely not be stuck in geopolitical confrontation. You will always recognize the higher level of unity where a conflict can be resolved. And that is why I think that this method of thinking of the coincidence of opposites is a pedagogical help to solve any problem on the planet now and in the future.